November 7th, 2021. In this city nestled between the Atlantic and the Everglades, everyday life in Fort Lauderdale, Florida is never far from the water.
The reason why Fort Lauderdale was dubbed Venice of America was because of the waterway.
Fort Lauderdale is a beautiful city with plenty of palm trees, beautiful weather, plenty of beaches, and beautiful people.
But this Sunday, one of those people has suddenly gone missing.
On November 7th, Ernest Gordon called into the Broward County Police Department to let them know that he had not seen his wife, Wanda, in 3 days.
Last time I saw her was Thursday when she left for work.
When he came home that night at 6 p.m., she's not there.
Ernest said he wasn't worried at first.
Initially, he thought maybe she's with her friends, maybe she's blowing off steam.
But then she didn't come home at all that night.
And she didn't show up at work on Friday.
That's when he started to get worried.
Ernest had been constantly calling her, texting her. She was not responding.
I'm afraid something's happened to her.
She would never just leave without notifying anyone.
Ernest Gordon was Wanda's second husband. The 42-year-old mother of four had married Keith Morris when they were both teenagers.
When I first got with Wanda, I was 16 years old. You know, we were kids. But I actually admired Wanda from a distance at first. Every time I seen her, it's like she had a beautiful smile that lit up a room.
Once they were together, Wanda and Keith wasted little time before starting a family.
She became a family woman, and at the end of the day, it always was family first.
You have someone who is very attentive, very loving.
But going from teenagers to parents put a strain on their relationship.
She used to get me to do a lot of things, you know, that I really didn't feel like doing, but it's like we always argued.
Wanda and Keith eventually split up.
It was hard, you know, with the separation.
But the couple didn't divorce until after Wanda started dating Ernest Gordon.
They met while Wanda was working as a school crossing guard.
How you learn to handle all them kids?
Well, I do have 4 of my own.
4?
Yes.
Wow, that's awesome.
Yes, and I love each and every one of them.
Usually in the dating pool, if a woman has children, men tend to shy away from that because that's responsibility. And so typically we as women, when we find a man that takes interest in us and our children, we're thinking, yep, this could be the right man for me.
Soon the two were seeing each other on a regular basis.
She meets this man who not only does she fall in love with, but he falls in love with her, he falls in love with her children, and most important of all, her children fall in love with Ernest.
He was very good to them.
3 years after her separation from her first husband, Wanda was ready to take a second chance with Keith's blessing.
I said, I see you happy, so let me go ahead and divorce you so you can get married to who you really want to be with.
Once her divorce was final, Wanda and Ernest married.
Ernest steps up. He takes on the children, especially the youngest, as if they were his very own. And it's a really nice, tight-knit, close family.
But now, the woman at the heart of that tight-knit family is missing, and no one has heard from her in 3 days.
I'm afraid something's happened to her.
An operator with the Broward County Sheriff's Office dispatches investigators to their home to file a missing persons report.
When police show up to interview Ernest, he's visibly upset, he's distraught, he's concerned.
He told them what he told the dispatcher over the phone, that he hadn't seen Wanda in 3 whole days.
Her purse is gone, and I can't find her phone.
The fact that her purse, her wallet, and her cell phone was missing may be an indication that she left on her own free will and that at the moment she did not want to be found.
although how she left is unclear.
Ernest told detectives that Wanda's car was parked outside.
You think someone gave your wife a ride?
I don't know.
Even if nothing happened and Wanda was fine, Ernest says she can still be in danger.
His wife was on various medications that she was taking on a daily basis.
She had a number of medical conditions. She had seizures. She suffered from depression. She had blood clots.
But according to Ernest, all of Wanda's pills are still in the cabinet.
And so with her being without her medication, there's a huge concern.
If she doesn't take her medicine, she could get real sick or worse.
They only had so much time to find her.
Mother of four, Wanda Gordon, had made a fresh start with her second husband, Ernest.
It takes a special type of person to take on another man's children and raise them as if they were his own.
But now Ernest has called the Broward County Sheriff's Office to his home to report that Wanda is missing.
No one had heard or seen Wanda in 3 days.
She didn't have her medicine with her when she disappeared. So this is really troubling to Ernest.
But it's unclear if something had happened or if she'd left of her own accord.
It doesn't look like anything unusual happened in the residence.
But her purse and her cell phone were also missing.
However, if Wanda left, she may not have been alone.
Her car was in the driveway.
You think someone gave your wife a ride?
I don't know.
But what Ernest says next adds an entirely new twist to the investigation.
Any idea if your wife was seeing someone else?
Well, to be honest, I'm not sure.
Ernest reveals that they were separated. They were still legally married, but separated and living in the house together.
It's my fault. We had a really good thing going, but I messed it up.
A year ago, Wanda had caught him cheating.
They're still living together because they want to have a united front for the children.
Ernest says that wasn't the only reason he stayed, though.
Ernest was on the page of, I want to fix this. I want to make this work. I have seen the error of my ways.
But he admitted that Wanda wasn't ready to believe him, much less take him back.
According to Ernest, that's why he wasn't at all concerned when she didn't come home Thursday night.
Maybe she was blowing off steam.
Or maybe she was looking to escape from her problems permanently.
You said one of her medicines was for depression, right?
Yeah.
The thought did occur that maybe she had done something to herself.
But when detectives ask, Ernest insists that suicide is out of the question.
Ernest said that there was no way that she had done anything to herself.
I can't believe she'd do that to the kids. She wouldn't want to hurt them like that.
When detectives follow up with Wanda's oldest son, who still lives in the home, he says his mother seemed fine the last time he saw her.
Wanda's 19-year-old son indicated that he had seen his mom on November 4th.
He saw her around 4 p.m. It was, business as usual. Her mood didn't seem off. Nothing raised any flags.
What exactly did she say to you?
We didn't talk a lot. She was on the phone.
You know who she was talking to?
Some guy, I think.
He knew his mom was dating after the recent separation with Ernest.
He told detectives that he wasn't sure if Ernest knew that Wanda had started dating again, but at the same time, Wanda was not trying to keep it a secret.
Exactly who she had been seeing? Her son had no idea.
All he knows is that was the last time he saw her.
Wanda's son shared with detectives that when he woke up on the morning of November 5th, he did not see his mother's car in the driveway around 7 o'clock.
Didn't really think anything of it. He went back to sleep.
When he woke up again around 8:30, he saw the car in the driveway.
So, Wanda's son had gone to her bedroom to check on her.
Ma, you home?
Wanda wasn't home, and it didn't look as if she'd been home the night before.
It looked as though she had not slept in the bed.
It was as if his mom had not even been there at all.
Her son's account fits with what Ernest told the police.
Ernest said he didn't see Wanda's car in the driveway when he left for work at 6 in the morning. So that leaves 90 minutes where no one had eyes on the driveway.
So someone had dropped the car off in that 90-minute window.
But where was Wanda now? And why would she leave without telling anyone?
Your mom and stepdad are separated, right?
Yeah, it's complicated.
They fight?
Sometimes.
They argued, but there was absolutely never any violence.
Ernest is he's a good guy. He's made some mistakes, but...
You think he had something to do with your mother being gone?
No, not Ernest.
He said he couldn't even fathom Ernest being violent.
Thank you. We'll be in touch.
Hoping to learn more about Wanda's love life, detectives return to the station and reach out to her sister, Lucy.
They spoke to each other not just daily, but several times a day.
She told Lucy everything,
including things she didn't tell her husband.
So you knew Wanda was dating again?
Oh, yeah.
Wanda had been using social media and online dating to try and meet suitable gentlemen.
Wanda's sister was clear that she thought they weren't all that suitable, though.
She had met some guys that were kind of weird.
What do you mean, weird?
It's embarrassing.
She says her sister started dabbling in some kind of sexual fetish, and that a lot of the men that she's speaking to on these apps are also involved in this type of sexual fetish.
What kind of things were they into?
She didn't tell me much, but it all felt strange.
Okay, did she actually meet anyone?
Well, she had been talking to this one guy.
Lucy pressed her sister for details about the guy, but Wanda was a little reluctant to give too many details.
She didn't know the guy's name.
But she did know when they were planning to meet.
Their first date was supposed to be on the night of the 4th.
That was the night that she disappeared.
Wanda Gordon's sister has told detectives that on the night the mother of four went missing, Wanda had a date with a man she'd met online.
Wanda and this gentleman that she was preparing to meet with had only been communicating through social media. This would be their very first time meeting each other face to face.
She didn't tell me his name.
Did she tell you anything about him?
Just that he was into what she was.
Wanda seemed excited, but that's really all Lucy knew.
Could the mystery man Wanda met online have something to do with her disappearance?
What happens if they went on a date and that date went bad?
There's always a fear that kind of hovers around online dating and meeting people through social media.
Is it possible that she met somebody? Absolutely. Is it possible that somebody wanted to cause harm to her? Absolutely.
After talking to Wanda's sister, the detectives focus on identifying Wanda's online suitor.
To Lucy's knowledge, Wanda and this gentleman that she was preparing to meet with had only been communicating through the dating app
which is where the detectives run into a roadblock.
The detectives had no idea what her username was or her password or even the email that she used to get into the site.
While detectives are spinning their wheels in cyberspace, Wanda's family is on the street, spreading the word that she's missing.
They put up flyers, speak to people themselves. They do a whole social media campaign.
Media outlets began airing the story.
And before too long, their efforts produce results.
After seeing a story on the news, the man Wanda had gone out with reached out to detectives.
His name is Tyrone Watkins.
He was very cooperative, willing to answer all of their questions.
Tyrone confirms that he and Wanda had been messaging for over a month.
He shows them text messages, the normal pre-date flirting.
But did you actually meet?
Yeah, just that one time.
The first time they met was on November 4th.
Tyrone says they met near the beach in Fort Lauderdale.
Now, despite the fact that they hooked up on a fetish site, what Tyrone described was surprisingly tame.
They hung out and they chatted, and they had a really, really nice time.
But according to Tyrone, that's when he learned that Wanda hadn't been entirely upfront with him.
It's something I really need to tell you.
Wanda revealed to him that she was still married, but planning to leave her husband.
It didn't sit right with Tyrone.
He wasn't comfortable with dating a married woman.
That make her mad?
Nah, she was cool with it.
He says they parted on friendly terms.
Tyrone asked her to text him to let him know that she had made it home safely.
He's being the true gentleman. Make sure that the woman gets home safe.
Tyrone says she didn't actually text him until after 1 o'clock that morning.
By then, he was asleep.
Tyrone said he then texted Wanda later in the morning around 9:20, and he never heard back.
Any idea why it was so late when she texted you?
She said she was going to the beach for a while. She seemed like she had a lot on her mind.
You still have that text too?
Yeah, it's all here.
When the detectives examine Tyrone's cell phone, it appears he's telling the truth.
They confirmed that Wanda sent a text to him letting him know that she got home.
He also shows them a receipt from the parking garage that he was in, and it's time-stamped, it's dated.
And when detectives pull footage from the city's beachfront surveillance cameras, they confirm that Tyrone and Wanda parted ways amicably.
Nothing unusual happened. She didn't seem distressed or disturbed. It was just sort of a normal, nice date.
However, something doesn't add up.
Tyrone says that Wanda was home at 1:20 in the morning, safe and sound, but Ernest says his wife never came home at all. Both stories can't be right.
Detectives needed to speak with Ernest again about the inconsistencies in his story.
So this time, detectives call Ernest down to the station to answer additional questions.
And you said she never came in?
Look, all I know is she wasn't home when I went to bed or when I left for work the next morning.
When was that?
I was asleep by 11:30 or so, and I leave for work at 6.
It's possible that she did come home, but he was sleeping.
Since they were sleeping in separate bedrooms, it's likely he wouldn't hear her come in.
So Ernest is standing by what he said.
However, he also has a new lead for the detectives.
Ernest offers up a new suspect, Keith Morris, Wanda's ex-husband.
Look, what I think y'all should do, in my opinion, is look into this Keith Morris. Him and Wanda, they was having custody issues.
According to Ernest, Keith had been acting strangely ever since Wanda went missing.
He says that after Wanda disappeared, Keith showed up at the house.
He's at the door. He wants the children.
I'm just here for my kids. I don't want any problems.
They're in my house. They're gonna stay in my house.
Wanda Gordon's estranged husband, Ernest, has suggested that detectives looking for the missing mother of 4 should talk to her ex-husband, Keith Morris.
Ernest believes that Keith has orchestrated all of this so that he wouldn't have to pay child support and that he would have custody of his youngest 2 children.
What makes you think that?
He came by the house the day after she disappeared. Told me he wanted the kids.
It's the kids. They're my kids.
The kids said they did not want to go with their biological father.
According to Ernest, Keith wouldn't listen.
Come on, look. I don't want to do this, Ernest, but just let me have my... You know what?
Oh, you gonna call the cops?
Yeah, as a matter of fact...
Bro, you tripping.
He said that Keith had called the police and demanded they make Ernest turn over the children.
My kids are in that house. This man won't give me my kids.
They are his kids.
He won't even let me see them.
Okay, why don't you take a step over there? Let me talk to the kids. We can bring them out. Let me talk to them. Hey, step over here. Hey, let me talk to them real quick, okay? Guys, you guys have a choice.
When police officers spoke to the children made it clear that they wanted to stay with Ernest. They had been with him for the last decade.
At this point, Keith left the kids with Ernest, but he did come back with a court order demanding that the kids be put in his custody.
You said he pays child support?
Every month.
He wants the kids. He has motive to get rid of her. It's something that has to be looked at.
Following up on Ernest's tip, detectives asked Keith to come down to the station for questioning.
The question that they was asking was like, when the last time you been around your ex-wife? And I'm like, I didn't bring any type of harm to her.
He said there was a simple explanation for why he asked Ernest for the kids.
We have an agreement through our divorce. If one of the other parent is not here until you find out what's going on, the children have to go with the other parent.
Look, I know my rights. Those are my kids, not his.
But does that mean Keith did nothing wrong?
This pre-existing agreement could have strengthened his motive to want to get rid of Wanda.
Detectives hope that her cell phone can give them the answer.
Detectives subpoena her cell phone records.
They do a deep dive into these records to get a little more understanding of Wanda's steps the night of her disappearance.
Wanda's cell phone data showed that she did arrive home at 1:20 a.m., just as Tyrone had told the detectives.
But she wasn't home for long.
A couple of hours later, the GPS shows that she leaves again. Her phone started moving away from the home again at around 4 a.m.
Both Ernest and Tyrone's stories might be correct. You know, Tyrone said she was home at 1:20, and Ernest said she may have left before he woke up at 6 a.m. And clearly, the GPS shows that she left at 4 a.m.
The GPS track leads west out of Fort Lauderdale towards the Everglades.
Her phone stopped in a rural area about 4:33 a.m.
GPS shows that her phone is there for a little while, maybe about 20 minutes, and then it shows that it leaves and goes to a different, secluded area.
The phone stays in that location until the battery ends up dying at around 1 o'clock in the morning on November 7th.
Police, retracing Wanda's steps, head out to the place where her phone was at 4:33 in the morning.
It turns out to be a large and well-secured construction site.
There are surveillance cameras everywhere around this construction site.
The owners did not want anyone coming out there stealing their equipment.
But could the cameras also tell the detectives something about Wanda's disappearance?
Police get a subpoena for the surveillance video.
When they view the footage from that particular morning, they see a white pickup truck pull in and then just sit there.
Until, after about 15 minutes, a Florida Wildlife Commission officer pulls up behind the pickup.
The Florida Wildlife Commission officer actually gets out of the car.
The wildlife conservation guy has a conversation with the guy in the white pickup truck. That's all documented on film.
Then they both leave the area.
The white pickup truck heads out, heading in the same direction, the same route that Wanda's phone is, according to the GPS records.
Detectives reach out to the Florida Wildlife Conservation and are eventually able to locate the officer in the video.
When they asked him to come in and talk to them, the wildlife officer said that he approached the truck on a suspicion of illegal dumping.
He says that he assumed that that is what this gentleman was doing because he saw 3 large garbage bags in the bed of the truck.
He actually took a picture of the bags in the back of the truck.
Then he let the man off with a warning.
The dumpsters here, they're for construction debris only.
He had a conversation with the gentleman about illegal dumping. The gentleman stated that that's not the reason he was there. He said he only came out there to clear his head because he had some things on his mind.
And based on what detectives learned next from the wildlife officer, they suspect that what the man had on his mind was murder.
All right. Drive safe.
Thank you, sir.
The driver was Ernest Gordon.
Detectives investigating Wanda Gordon's disappearance have traced her husband Ernest to the same location as Wanda's cell phone at 4:30 on the morning she disappeared.
They have an eyewitness that puts Ernest at the scene, but Ernest told detectives that he was home sleeping all night long.
The lie isn't all that makes Ernest the prime suspect in what police now believe is a homicide.
The location where a wildlife officer approached Ernest was on the edge of the Everglades.
Unfortunately, at this point, the police are no longer looking for a missing person. They're actually looking for Wanda's body.
And detectives have a pretty good idea where they'll find it, too.
They had the GPS information from Wanda's phone.
The last known location of the cell phone before it died was a very swampy, wooded area in Tamarack, Florida.
Despite the difficult terrain, the searchers soon find something.
They find a black cell phone. They find several articles of clothing. They find red and black dreadlocks that actually match the dreadlocks that Wanda used to wear in her hair.
They also note an odor foul enough to pierce the pungent Everglades air.
Looks like probably something in there.
Kind of looking, I didn't want to
See how you have a lot of that decomp stuff around there?
You could possibly smell the decomp depending on how long she's been out there.
Tracing the odor to its source, the searchers start to uncover human remains.
It's 1 of 2. The other one's over here.
Eventually, the gruesome search yields more remains.
They actually found a human jawbone and a skull.
The detectives assume they found Wanda, but the autopsy is unable to confirm it.
Just looking at the skull and at the jawbone, the medical examiner thinks that they belong to a female. But unfortunately, there's so much decay that they can't say for certain that these are Wanda's remains.
Whoever she was, the autopsy revealed how she died.
The medical examiner discovered a large fracture on the side of the skull and determined that this was the fatal wound.
However, Before they can charge Ernest with murder, detectives will have to confirm that the remains are Wanda's.
They had to secure DNA from Wanda's daughter.
However, the results would take some time to find out if there was a match.
While they wait, the detectives attempt to put Ernest closer to the location where they found the remains.
They contact the Tamarack Police Department and they ask them if they can review traffic cameras.
Since it was deep in the swamp, there weren't any cameras in the close proximity where the police found the remains. But there were several in the broader vicinity.
Wouldn't you know it, right there, on tape, about 5 miles from the dump site, there's Ernest's truck, captured on camera.
However, there is one thing the camera doesn't capture.
The garbage bags are no longer in the back of Ernest's truck.
It looked like Ernest was engaged in a little illegal dumping after all.
To strengthen the evidence further, detectives also subpoena Ernest's cell phone records.
Police take a look now into Ernest's GPS to see if they can trace his movement to that particular location.
During the time that Wanda's phone was moving, Ernest's phone was not moving. In fact, his phone was still at the house.
They figured that he deliberately left his cell phone home to throw off the investigation.
However, the records also reveal that on the following night, Ernest neglected to leave his phone behind.
Ernest had traveled to the exact location where the remains were found at 11 o'clock that night on November the 5th.
Was he checking to make sure that the body was not visible, was not in plain sight?
For him to go back to that location showed that he knew where she was at. It showed that he was involved.
With proof putting Ernest at the location where the body was found, the detectives bring him in for another round of questioning.
We just want to go over your movements on November 4th and 5th.
Okay, but I already told you guys everything.
Everything?
But then he remembers something he hadn't told them.
When they asked him about the Florida Wildlife Commissioner stopping him that evening, he stated that he had forgot that he had gone out.
He claimed that he was just driving around to clear his head.
Then he said he went straight home.
You didn't stop and throw anything away?
What do you mean?
According to the wildlife officer, you had some garbage bags in the back of your truck.
He's got an answer for that, too. He says, oh, those bags were from some landscaping I had done.
He said he threw them out a few days later.
You sure about that?
The police keep putting pressure on Ernest.
Officers informed him that his pickup truck had been caught on a traffic camera.
And eventually, Ernest starts to crack.
I don't know. I don't know anything. I don't know where.
When detectives confront Ernest Gordon about the suspicious drive he took to the Everglades the night his wife Wanda disappeared, they believe his response is telling.
He breaks down, he's devastated, he's crying.
But Ernest's tears aren't followed by a confession.
I don't know what happened. Look, I don't know anything.
In spite of all of this evidence that they are presenting before him, he maintains that he does not know what happened to Wanda.
He didn't admit that he killed her. He didn't deny it. He basically just had no explanation.
Instead, he stops the interview and asks for an attorney.
I want a lawyer.
They say, is it because you had something to do with your wife's disappearance or death? He refuses to answer.
Detectives are sure they found Wanda's killer. All they lack is proof that they found her.
The remains, the skull and the jawbone, haven't been identified yet.
They have no confirmation as to who that body was, so they had to let Ernest go.
But even as Ernest walks, the detectives keep digging.
Officers have enough evidence to get a search warrant for the Gordons' home and also for Ernest's white pickup truck.
They searched both using a chemical called luminol, which reacts with blood under black light.
They find blood. Lots of blood in Wanda's bedroom.
The luminol test also finds blood in the back of Ernest's pickup.
It revealed traces of blood in the same area where those 3 trash bags were located, on the back of Ernest's truck.
Between the blood, cell phone records, and other evidence, the detectives develop a clear picture of how the crime most likely occurred.
They had a theory that Ernest was actually up waiting for Wanda to come home, knowing that she had been out on a date.
Wanda returned home from her date around 1:20 in the morning, and Ernest was waiting. And Ernest was mad.
Stop! I know what you've been doing. This ain't your business what I'm doing. I'm not gonna tell you.
They got into an argument over either the divorce or the infidelity, her moving on and going out and dating other people.
He was not able to handle the fact that she was out seeing other people.
So, the situation escalated.
Don't you walk away from me!
Ernest had lost control. Not just in the heat of the moment, he lost control over how Wanda saw him when the infidelity happened.
And desperate to regain it, he lashed out.
Ernest must have picked up a blunt, heavy object and hit Wanda.
He hit her on the side of the head, which was fatal.
Once he realized what he did and that she was dead, he tried to cover it up.
And now all detectives need is the one piece of evidence to tie everything together: Wanda's DNA.
On December 9th, the results are in, and it shows conclusively that the remains found in the swamp are those, unfortunately, of Wanda Gordon.
An arrest warrant was issued for Ernest. He was taken into custody the very next day.
He's charged with second-degree murder.
As a trial date approaches, Ernest faces reality.
His lawyer came to me and told me out front that he doesn't want to go to trial. The agreement was that in return for a guilty plea, he would be sentenced to 50 years in Florida State Prison.
It's also essentially a life sentence.
He is in his 40s, so he will be in his 90s when and if he ever gets out.
But no matter how long Ernest spends in prison, it doesn't ease the pain of losing Wanda.
You took somebody away despite the ups and downs that me and her had. You took somebody away that is dear to me and my children.
The family is going to be feeling the fallout of that forever.
In the summer of 1982, people living around Seattle, Washington, believed they understood danger. They knew which streets to avoid after dark. They knew the stretches of Pacific Highway South where young women waited beneath flickering motel signs, hoping that the next car to slow down would bring enough money to survive another night. They knew that some people disappeared. It was an unfortunate truth that many chose not to think about for very long. Runaways left home every day. Women struggling with addiction often vanished without anyone filing an immediate report. Missing posters faded beneath rain before many strangers even noticed the faces. Then the river began to speak. It did not speak with words. It spoke through silence. Through bodies discovered where no one should ever have been found. Through frightened detectives standing on muddy riverbanks, realizing that one tragedy had become something far larger than anyone had imagined. At first, each discovery looked like another isolated crime. Another young woman whose life had ended in violence. Another investigation destined to grow cold. But as the weeks unfolded, the pattern became impossible to ignore. The victims shared striking similarities. Most were young. Many had lived difficult lives. Some had run away from broken homes. Others survived through prostitution, existing on the edges of a society that often looked away from them. They disappeared quietly. Few witnesses remembered the last car they entered. Fewer still remembered the face behind the steering wheel. Somewhere among millions of ordinary people, someone had learned how to hunt those who were least likely to be immediately missed. Police officers searched wooded hillsides, abandoned lots, and riverbanks. Helicopters circled overhead. Detectives spread photographs across conference tables until every face seemed to blend into the next. Families waited beside telephones that never rang. Mothers drove familiar roads, convincing themselves that perhaps their daughters had simply left town. Fathers rehearsed hopeful explanations they no longer believed. Friends stared at empty chairs in coffee shops, wondering whether they should continue expecting someone who would never return. The fear spread long before the public understood its true scale. Rumors moved faster than official announcements. Truck drivers whispered about bodies found near logging roads. Motel clerks exchanged uneasy glances when another missing person's photograph appeared on the evening news. Women who worked the streets began memorizing license plates whenever possible. They warned each other about unfamiliar vehicles, strange customers, and quiet men who smiled too easily. Every slow-moving pickup became a reason to hesitate. Every offer of easy money carried an invisible question. Would this be the last ride? The man responsible for that fear never looked like the monster people imagined. He did not lurk in abandoned buildings wearing dark clothes. He did not fit the frightening image that newspapers often attached to serial killers. He woke before work. He held a steady job. He spoke politely. He attended church. Neighbors saw him mowing his lawn. Co-workers knew him as a dependable employee who rarely attracted attention. He blended into crowds with remarkable ease, because nothing about his appearance demanded a second look. That ordinary face became his greatest disguise. Years later, seasoned investigators would admit that this realization disturbed them more than almost anything else. Evil had not arrived wearing a mask. It had arrived carrying a lunchbox. The investigation that followed would become one of the largest homicide investigations in American history. Hundreds of detectives, forensic scientists, volunteers, and analysts would spend decades chasing fragments of evidence scattered across forests, rivers, highways, and forgotten memories. Thousands of tips would pour into police departments. Mountains of paperwork would fill evidence rooms. Every promising lead seemed to dissolve just as hope began to grow. Meanwhile, the killer continued living an ordinary life. He went to work. He returned home. He smiled at neighbors. He watched television. And somewhere between those ordinary routines, more young women disappeared. What made the case especially heartbreaking was not simply the number of victims. It was who they were. Many had spent their lives fighting battles invisible to strangers. Some had escaped abusive homes only to find themselves living on dangerous streets. Others struggled with addiction, poverty, or exploitation before they ever crossed paths with the man who would ultimately end their lives. Too often, their disappearances received less attention because society had quietly decided their lives mattered less than others. Yet every victim had once been somebody's child. Every missing woman had laughed at inside jokes. Every one of them had favorite songs, childhood memories, dreams that never had the opportunity to become reality. Some loved drawing. Some wanted to become mothers. Some hoped to return to school. Some simply wanted tomorrow to be better than yesterday. Those dreams vanished one by one, leaving families trapped inside decades of unanswered questions. As investigators searched deeper into the mystery, another unsettling truth emerged. The killer was patient. He did not rush. He chose victims carefully. He understood where police patrols were less frequent. He understood which disappearances might not immediately trigger widespread searches. He understood how to leave behind almost nothing that investigators could use. In an era before modern DNA technology transformed criminal investigations, those small advantages proved devastating. Time became his accomplice. Every month without an arrest strengthened his confidence. Every unsuccessful search encouraged him to believe he would never be caught. While detectives worked around the clock comparing witness statements and examining physical evidence, the killer adapted. He changed routines. He remained calm during police interviews. Even when investigators began to suspect him years before his eventual arrest, there was not enough scientific evidence to place him at the scenes beyond reasonable doubt. It was a chilling reminder that sometimes law enforcement knows exactly who they fear, yet still lacks the tools needed to prove it. The years stretched into decades. Children grew into adults, while still wondering what had happened to missing sisters. Parents died before learning the truth about daughters who never came home. Boxes containing unsolved evidence gathered dust inside secure storage rooms, preserved by investigators who refused to believe the case would remain unsolved forever. Technology, however, continued advancing. The smallest biological traces once considered useless gradually became invaluable. Scientific methods improved. DNA profiling reached levels of precision that investigators, during the early 1980s, could scarcely have imagined. Evidence that had waited silently for years suddenly possessed the ability to answer questions that witnesses never could. The case that had haunted Washington for nearly 20 years was about to change forever. When detectives finally confronted the man whose name would become permanently linked to the Green River murders, many expected defiance, anger, or denial. Instead, they encountered someone remarkably ordinary. That ordinariness was perhaps the most disturbing discovery of all. History often encourages people to imagine monsters as visibly different from everyone else. Reality is rarely so accommodating. Some of the most devastating crimes are committed not by people who appear terrifying, but by individuals who seem forgettable. That uncomfortable truth continues to shape criminal investigations today, reminding detectives that appearances reveal remarkably little about the capacity for violence hidden beneath everyday routines. The Green River investigation was never simply the story of one serial killer. It was the story of dozens of stolen lives, of families who refused to stop searching, of detectives who carried photographs of victims in briefcases for decades, and of scientific breakthroughs that finally gave voices to evidence long thought silent. It exposed weaknesses in missing person investigations, forced difficult conversations about how society values vulnerable victims, and forever changed the way serial homicide cases would be investigated across the United States. Long before a courtroom finally delivered justice, before DNA connected evidence to a single suspect, before headlines revealed the name Gary Ridgway to the world, there was only uncertainty. A quiet highway. A winding river. A growing list of missing women. And a question that haunted an entire state. How could one man hide in plain sight for so long? By the early 1980s, Seattle was a city caught between two identities. To outsiders, It was a place of towering evergreens, snow-capped mountains, busy shipyards, and growing technology companies. The skyline reflected ambition, while the surrounding forests offered postcard views that attracted tourists from across the country. On clear mornings, Mount Rainier stood like a silent guardian over western Washington, its white peak visible for miles. Ferries crossed Puget Sound with dependable rhythm, carrying commuters between neighborhoods that seemed peaceful and prosperous. Yet beyond those familiar images existed another Seattle that rarely appeared in travel brochures. Only a few miles from thriving business districts, entire communities struggled with poverty, addiction, unstable housing, and exploitation. Along Pacific Highway South, stretching through parts of South King County toward Tacoma, dozens of aging motels stood shoulder to shoulder beneath faded neon signs. Cheap weekly rooms offered temporary shelter for people with nowhere else to go. Truck stops remained busy throughout the night. Bars stayed open until the early hours. Cars came and went without attracting attention. Faces changed constantly. Names were forgotten almost as quickly as they were spoken. It was a place where survival often depended on making difficult choices. For many young women, Pacific Highway South represented both opportunity and danger. Some had run away from abusive homes, believing life on the streets could not possibly be worse than what they had left behind. Others struggled with addiction that had slowly consumed every relationship they once trusted. Some drifted into prostitution after losing jobs or escaping violent partners. A few were barely old enough to understand how quickly hope could disappear. Despite their different stories, they shared one painful reality. Society often looked past them. If they disappeared for a few days, friends sometimes assumed they had traveled with another customer. If they vanished for weeks, families wondered whether shame or fear had simply kept them away. Missing person reports were not always filed immediately. Even when they were, investigators faced an impossible challenge. Adults had the legal right to leave if they wished. Without evidence of foul play, there were countless reasons someone might choose not to be found. That uncertainty created the perfect hunting ground for someone patient enough to exploit it. The Pacific Northwest itself seemed built for secrecy. Dense forests stretched for miles beyond city limits. Logging roads twisted through hills where sunlight barely reached the ground. Thick undergrowth swallowed abandoned campsites and forgotten clearings. Heavy rain softened footprints within hours. Fallen leaves buried tire tracks beneath fresh layers of debris. During winter, cold winds swept across valleys, while fog settled over rivers before sunrise, hiding entire landscapes beneath pale gray blankets. Nature possessed an extraordinary ability to erase evidence. Investigators would later spend thousands of hours searching these forests, discovering firsthand just how vast the region truly was. Even with helicopters, trained search teams, and tracking dogs, enormous sections remained untouched. Every hill concealed another ravine. Every narrow trail disappeared behind towering cedar and fir trees. A body hidden only a few yards away could remain undiscovered for months, sometimes years. For anyone attempting to conceal terrible crimes, the landscape offered countless opportunities. Meanwhile, life continued as normal for millions of residents. Children boarded school buses each morning. Office workers hurried toward downtown buildings carrying briefcases and coffee cups. Construction crews poured concrete beneath gray skies. Families gathered for weekend barbecues whenever the rain briefly stopped. The contrast was almost impossible to comprehend. While ordinary routines unfolded across western Washington, another story was quietly developing beyond public attention. Young women continued disappearing, often without headlines, without widespread searches, and without immediate public concern. Among those moving through the same streets, every day was a man named Gary Leon Ridgway. Nothing about him seemed remarkable. Born on February 18, 1949, Ridgway had grown up in a working-class household where conflict was common. Those who later examined his childhood described a home marked by tension, strict discipline, and emotionally complicated relationships. His mother exercised an overwhelming influence over him, often controlling small aspects of daily life. Years later, psychologists would debate how much that relationship shaped his adult behavior. While no childhood experience can explain or excuse the crimes he eventually committed, investigators believed his early years offered important clues into the development of his personality. Even as a teenager, warning signs appeared. At approximately 16 years old, Ridgway attacked a young boy with a knife. The victim survived, and the assault never became the defining moment it should have been. Instead of launching years of close observation, the incident faded into the background of his life. Ridgway continued growing into adulthood, carrying impulses that few people around him fully understood. He was not an exceptional student. He was not especially charismatic. He rarely attracted attention. If anything, people often described him as painfully ordinary. That ordinariness became one of his greatest advantages. After finishing school, Ridgway served briefly in the United States Navy before returning to Washington. Eventually, he secured stable employment as a truck painter at the Kenworth manufacturing plant. It was physically demanding work that rewarded consistency rather than creativity. Co-workers remembered him arriving on time, completing assignments, and keeping mostly to himself. Supervisors saw a dependable employee who blended easily into the daily routine. Nothing about his professional life hinted at the darkness hidden beneath it. Outside work, Ridgway attempted to build what appeared to be a normal family life. He married multiple times over the years and became a father. Neighbors saw him maintaining his yard, driving familiar routes, and participating in ordinary suburban routines. He attended church during certain periods of his life and often presented himself as a quiet, respectful man. He understood exactly how to appear harmless. That ability mattered. Most people imagine violent offenders as constantly angry, unpredictable individuals whose dangerous nature is obvious to everyone around them. Real life is often far more unsettling. Many serial offenders successfully maintain jobs, relationships, and ordinary social interactions while secretly committing unimaginable crimes. Their greatest weapon is not physical strength alone, but the trust they inspire simply by appearing ordinary. Ridgway mastered that deception. He learned how to smile politely. He learned when to remain silent. He rarely displayed emotions intense enough to make others uncomfortable. His calm demeanor reassured strangers before they ever realized they should be afraid. After finishing work, he frequently drove along Pacific Highway South. To passing motorists, his vehicle looked no different from hundreds of others traveling the same road. Yet while commuters headed home for dinner, Ridgway searched for vulnerable women standing alone beneath motel lights or waiting near convenience stores. He understood the routines of the area. He knew where women gathered. He recognized which parking lots attracted sex workers. He observed police patrol patterns. Most importantly, he understood that many of the women he encountered lived lives so unstable that their disappearances might not immediately trigger alarm. It was not random violence. It was calculated selection. The women he approached came from different backgrounds, but many carried burdens invisible to strangers. Addiction, homelessness, abuse, untreated mental illness, fractured families, and financial desperation had pushed them toward dangerous circumstances. Yet reducing them to those struggles would ignore who they truly were. They were daughters. Some still wrote letters to parents. Some called younger siblings whenever they found a pay phone. Some dreamed of escaping addiction. Some imagined returning to school. Others hoped to save enough money for an apartment, a fresh start, or simply a quieter life. Each possessed a history far richer than the brief labels often attached to them after their deaths. Unfortunately, society during the early 1980s frequently viewed women involved in prostitution through the lens of judgment rather than compassion. Their disappearances were sometimes met with assumptions instead of urgency. Detectives worked hard to investigate every report, but resources were limited, communication systems were slower than today, and cases involving vulnerable adults often struggled to gain immediate public attention. These realities did not create the killer. But they created conditions he exploited with chilling efficiency. As weeks passed, during the summer of 1982, whispers spread among women working Pacific Highway South. Someone dangerous was out there. Customers who once seemed merely awkward suddenly inspired fear. Women exchanged descriptions of suspicious vehicles whenever they crossed paths. Friends warned one another never to leave with unfamiliar men without memorizing license plates. Some refused rides altogether if anything felt unusual. Others could not afford to be selective. Hunger, addiction, or the need for a motel room often outweighed instinct. The predator understood this painful truth. He knew desperation could silence caution. He also knew that kindness, or the appearance of kindness, lowered defenses faster than threats ever could. Unlike fictional villains who rely on intimidation, Ridgway often presented himself as calm, patient, and trustworthy. Witnesses would later describe a man who appeared polite, who spoke casually, and who sometimes even carried photographs of his young son. Showing those pictures created an image of normal family life. It suggested stability, responsibility, safety. For women accustomed to unpredictable and sometimes violent customers, an ordinary middle-aged man talking about his child did not immediately appear threatening. That illusion would prove devastating. As summer gradually shifted toward autumn, no one yet understood they were witnessing the beginning of one of America's deadliest serial murder cases. Individual disappearances still seemed disconnected. Families searched independently. Detectives opened separate files. Newspapers reported isolated discoveries without recognizing the full pattern beginning to emerge across King County. The storm had already begun. Most people simply could not see its shape yet. Hidden beneath Seattle's gray skies, and surrounded by forests that seemed endless, an ordinary-looking man continued following the same roads day after day, while an invisible trail of grief slowly stretched behind him, one missing woman at a time. Long before their names appeared in police files, long before detectives pinned photographs to crowded investigation boards, and long before newspapers reduced their lives to brief paragraphs beneath alarming headlines, they were simply young women trying to find their place in a complicated world. Some were daughters who once raced bicycles down quiet suburban streets. Some spent warm summer evenings laughing with friends over milkshakes after school football games. Some dreamed of becoming nurses, hairdressers, artists, or mothers. Some loved animals. Others filled notebooks with poems that no one else ever read. A few carried childhood photographs everywhere they went because they wanted to remember a time when life still felt safe. Their stories did not begin with tragedy. Like everyone else, they began with hope. One of the greatest misconceptions surrounding the Green River murders was that the victims had little in common beyond the circumstances of their disappearances. In reality, while their lives followed different paths, many shared experiences that made them especially vulnerable. Broken families, poverty, addiction, abuse, unstable housing, and exploitation were recurring themes, not because these women lacked strength, but because they were forced to navigate challenges that many others never had to face. Their vulnerability was never their identity. It was simply one chapter in lives that deserved far more understanding than they often received. Many were still teenagers. Some had barely reached adulthood. Several had left home believing independence would solve problems they felt powerless to confront. Instead, they encountered new dangers waiting beyond familiar neighborhoods. Cheap motels became temporary homes. Friends changed constantly. Trust became a luxury. Every day revolved around finding food, shelter, or enough money to survive until morning. For some, prostitution was not a choice born from opportunity. It was the final option after every safer alternative had disappeared. One young woman had once written letters describing dreams of returning to school after getting her life back on track. Another frequently called her parents, promising that she would visit soon, even when she knew she had nowhere permanent to live. One carried photographs of younger siblings in her purse, because she missed birthdays she could not afford to attend. Another loved music so deeply that she hummed songs while walking between motels, believing that familiar melodies somehow made lonely nights less frightening. These were not anonymous faces. They were people whose lives extended far beyond the labels later attached to them. Families remembered birthdays. Friends remembered laughter. Teachers remembered quiet students who smiled despite difficult circumstances. Neighbors remembered children riding bicycles through sprinklers during summer afternoons. Every victim carried a history that deserved to be remembered in full, not merely the moment when it was violently interrupted. Among those later identified as victims was a 15-year-old runaway whose family never stopped hoping she might somehow return home. Another was only 16, still young enough that adulthood remained more imagination than reality. Others were in their early 20s, believing they still had time to rebuild relationships damaged by addiction or financial hardship. Every disappearance created a circle of grief. Parents waited by telephones long after midnight. Siblings searched familiar neighborhoods, hoping to recognize a familiar face. Friends revisited places where they had last shared conversations, replaying every detail in search of overlooked clues. Sometimes they convinced themselves that silence meant safety. Maybe she had found work in another city. Maybe she had decided to begin again somewhere else. Maybe she would walk through the front door tomorrow. Hope can survive astonishing lengths of time, even when evidence quietly argues otherwise. In the early weeks of the disappearances, uncertainty became almost unbearable. Without confirmation of death, families existed in a painful space between optimism and despair. Every unidentified person found in another county demanded attention. Every telephone call caused hearts to race. Every knock at the door carried possibilities too frightening to name. For investigators, each missing person report represented another puzzle piece whose significance was not immediately obvious. Adults disappeared every day. Teenagers ran away from home. People struggling with addiction sometimes vanished for weeks before contacting loved ones again. Separating ordinary disappearances from criminal acts required time that the killer understood he possessed. Meanwhile, the women themselves continued living extraordinarily difficult lives before many of them vanished. Pacific Highway South never truly slept. As evening settled across King County, motel parking lots filled with headlights reflecting off wet pavement. Rainwater collected in cracked asphalt, while passing trucks sprayed mist into the night air. Neon vacancy signs buzzed softly above aging buildings, whose walls had witnessed thousands of forgotten stories. Women waited beneath streetlights, jackets pulled tightly against the damp wind, watching traffic slow and accelerate in endless rhythm. Conversations rarely lasted long. A passing customer. A negotiated price. Another car disappearing into darkness. Hours blurred together beneath gray skies, that seemed almost permanent during Washington's colder months. Yet even within those harsh surroundings, moments of ordinary humanity survived. Women shared cigarettes outside motel rooms while discussing favorite television shows. Someone celebrated a birthday with convenience store cupcakes. Friends borrowed sweaters when temperatures dropped unexpectedly. One woman braided another's hair before the evening began. Someone laughed so loudly that nearby truck drivers turned their heads. Life persisted despite hardship. That humanity is often overlooked when serial murder cases become famous. Public attention naturally gravitates toward investigators, forensic evidence, and perpetrators, while victims gradually become statistics repeated in documentaries or courtroom summaries. The Green River case challenged that tendency, because detectives increasingly recognized that understanding the victims, their routines, friendships, fears, and daily movements, was essential to understanding the killer himself. Every conversation mattered. Every friendship offered possible answers. Every last known sighting became part of an enormous timeline investigators desperately tried to assemble. As reports accumulated, another painful pattern emerged. Many families feared they would not be believed. Parents worried that admitting a daughter had struggled with drugs or prostitution might cause police to dismiss the disappearance. Some delayed reporting loved ones missing because previous absences had ended safely. Others simply did not know where to begin searching. Communication between jurisdictions during the early 1980s lacked the speed investigators enjoy today. Information often traveled through paperwork, telephone calls, and manual record systems rather than instant digital databases. Days became weeks. Weeks became months. With every passing disappearance, uncertainty deepened. Among women still working along Pacific Highway South, fear slowly replaced routine. Faces disappeared from familiar corners. Someone who usually arrived before sunset no longer appeared. Another failed to return to the motel where friends expected her. Rumors circulated constantly. Maybe she had moved away. Maybe she had been arrested. Maybe she had found a boyfriend. Or maybe something far worse had happened. No one wanted to say the final possibility aloud. Still, everyone thought about it. Despite the danger surrounding them, many women continued looking after one another whenever possible. They memorized suspicious vehicles. They warned newcomers about aggressive customers. They exchanged names whenever someone accepted a ride. Small acts of protection became survival strategies in an environment where official safeguards often felt distant. But no system built on memory alone could stop someone determined to avoid attention. The man responsible understood how ordinary he appeared. He did not rush conversations. He did not immediately inspire fear. Witnesses who later described encounters with him often remembered politeness before anything else. That calm exterior allowed him to move through environments where obvious aggression would have drawn immediate suspicion. For many victims, the decision to enter his vehicle likely felt no different from dozens of previous encounters. That ordinary beginning makes the tragedy even more heartbreaking. There was no dramatic warning. No unmistakable sign. Only another customer. Another conversation. Another promise of payment. Then silence. Back at home, families unknowingly continued their daily routines. Mothers prepared dinners while expecting daughters to call later. Fathers left porch lights burning through the night. Brothers and sisters argued over television channels, unaware that someone they loved would never again walk through the front door. Empty bedrooms slowly transformed into places suspended in time. Clothes remained folded exactly as they had been left. Photographs gathered dust on dressers. Birthday cards arrived without recipients to open them. Christmas decorations appeared each winter beside an empty chair that quietly reminded everyone of who was missing. Years later, relatives would describe how grief without certainty differs from grief after confirmed loss. When there is no body, no explanation, and no final goodbye, the mind endlessly invents possibilities. Hope refuses to disappear completely, even when reason suggests otherwise. Every unidentified woman reported somewhere else in the country became another chance that perhaps the missing daughter, sister, or friend had survived. That hope, however painful, kept many families searching long after others assumed the women had been forgotten. Investigators would eventually learn that nothing about these victims justified the indifference they sometimes encountered. Each solved identification revealed another deeply personal story interrupted far too soon. Their lives became the emotional foundation of an investigation that ultimately stretched across decades. The Green River case was never only about finding a killer. It was about restoring names to women who had too often been reduced to stereotypes. It was about reminding an entire nation that vulnerability does not diminish human worth. It was about proving that every victim deserved the same determination, the same compassion, and the same pursuit of justice, regardless of how difficult her life had become. Before detectives uncovered forensic breakthroughs, before DNA transformed impossible questions into undeniable answers, and before one ordinary-looking factory worker became known around the world, there were dozens of unfinished stories waiting to be heard. This investigation would eventually expose a predator who believed his victims would disappear without consequence. History would prove him wrong. Because even after decades of silence, their names, and the search for justice on their behalf, refused to disappear. The incident did not announce itself with violence that anyone could clearly recognize in the moment. There was no sound that lingered long enough to draw attention. No scream that reached beyond the noise of passing traffic, rain against pavement, or the constant hum of engines along Pacific Highway South. Instead, what happened in those final moments, repeated across different nights, different streets, different lives, followed a pattern so ordinary on the surface that it often went unnoticed until it was already too late. A conversation. A decision. A disappearance. And then, nothing that could immediately be traced. In the summer and early autumn of 1982, reports of missing women began to accumulate across King County with increasing urgency. At first, each case was treated individually. A teenage runaway from a suburban neighborhood. A young woman known to struggle with addiction. Another who had been living temporarily in motels along the highway corridor. Separate files, separate timelines, separate assumptions. But investigators working those cases would later realize that they were not looking at isolated tragedies. They were standing at different points along the same path. The last confirmed sightings of many victims shared unsettling similarities. They often occurred near the same stretch of roadway, where commercial buildings gave way to darker, less monitored spaces. Parking lots behind motels. Convenience stores operating under flickering fluorescent lights. Bus stops that emptied after midnight. The edges of places where people came and went without leaving records behind. Witnesses described brief interactions rather than long encounters. A woman standing near the curb. A vehicle slowing beside her. A conversation too distant for details to be fully remembered later. Sometimes there was a smile involved. Sometimes a gesture. Sometimes a few words exchanged through a half-open window. The human mind, especially when recalling ordinary moments later clouded by tragedy, tends to preserve fragments rather than complete scenes. What remained consistent was not the exact dialogue, but the sense that nothing about the interaction initially seemed unusual enough to trigger alarm. That is what made the pattern so difficult to detect in real time. For those who later became victims, the man they encountered did not immediately present himself as danger. He appeared calm, patient, familiar in a way that did not demand suspicion. He often blended into the environment of the highway corridor, where strangers routinely approached strangers, and where trust was often measured in seconds rather than conversations. To many people in that world, a ride offered by a seemingly ordinary man did not stand out as extraordinary. It was simply another option among many imperfect choices. And in those brief windows of decision, lives were redirected in ways no one could yet see. After leaving those final known locations, the women disappeared from view. Some were expected to return within hours. Others had arrangements to meet friends later that night or the following morning. A few carried belongings that suggested they were not planning to vanish permanently: purses, jackets, small personal items that would later be found abandoned or never recovered at all. When they failed to appear, the first reactions were often not immediate panic. In many cases, there were explanations that seemed plausible at the time. Plans changed. Transportation issues occurred. Phone calls were missed. Someone decided to stay with a friend unexpectedly. Life on the margins often made unpredictability feel normal. But as hours turned into days, concern began to grow in a different direction. Family members started calling around. Friends retraced familiar routes. Motel staff were asked questions they could not always answer. Police reports were eventually filed, each one adding another entry to a growing list that investigators struggled to fully connect. One missing person was a tragedy. Several missing persons became a troubling coincidence. Dozens began to suggest something far more systematic. Yet at the time, that larger picture remained just out of reach. The geography itself worked against early understanding. The Pacific Highway South Corridor was not a single defined environment, but a long stretch of overlapping spaces, commercial zones, residential edges, industrial lots, wooded patches, and highway access points. It was a place designed for movement rather than permanence. People entered and exited constantly. Surveillance was limited. Lighting was inconsistent. And in many areas, there were no witnesses beyond those who were also transient. For someone seeking to avoid detection, it was a landscape that offered almost ideal conditions. Investigators would later reconstruct likely scenarios based on patterns, interviews, and forensic evidence gathered from multiple scenes. They understood that the final moments of contact often involved minimal resistance opportunity, not because of any absence of fear or awareness, but because of the suddenness with which control shifted. What began as an ordinary interaction could change in an instant. After that moment, the ability of victims to signal distress, seek help, or escape was severely limited by circumstances that were never visible from the outside. This is one of the most difficult aspects of the case to describe, even for those who worked it for years. Because the transition from normalcy to disappearance was not marked by dramatic escalation visible to the public. It was marked by absence. A gap where communication should have continued. A silence where life should have resumed. Back in homes across King County, that silence became deeply personal. A telephone that did not ring. A door that did not open. A scheduled meeting that never occurred. At first, families often attempted to rationalize what they were experiencing. They searched hospitals. They called friends. They visited known locations. They checked shelters and clinics. They retraced habitual routes through neighborhoods and downtown areas. Each step carried the same underlying hope, that the absence was temporary, explainable, reversible. But as each hour passed without resolution, that hope began to fracture. By the time missing persons reports were officially filed in multiple cases, investigators were already facing a rapidly expanding workload. Names were added faster than they could be fully investigated. Leads required verification. Witness statements needed follow-up. Physical evidence, when available, had to be carefully collected and preserved in conditions that were not always ideal in the early stages of the investigation. In several instances, delays in reporting further complicated efforts to reconstruct timelines. The longer a person had been missing before authorities were notified, the more fragmented the available information became. Yet even within that uncertainty, a troubling pattern began to emerge. Many of the last known locations clustered along the same corridors. Many of the victims shared similar vulnerabilities. And many of the disappearances occurred within a relatively concentrated period of time. Still, the idea of a single responsible individual was not immediately accepted as the primary explanation. Investigators initially considered multiple possibilities, including unrelated acts of violence, voluntary disappearances, and other criminal activity occurring independently across the region. The scale of what was unfolding was difficult to comprehend. And perhaps more importantly, there was not yet enough physical evidence to unify the cases conclusively. Meanwhile, life continued along the highway. Traffic moved in both directions beneath damp night skies. Motel signs flickered. Gas stations remained open through the early hours. Trucks idled at intersections waiting for green lights that seemed to take too long to arrive. For most people passing through, nothing about the environment suggested that something extraordinary was happening beneath its surface. That invisibility was part of what made the case so difficult to confront in its early stages. There was no single scene that captured the full reality. No immediate point of certainty. Only fragments scattered across time and geography, waiting for someone to recognize that they belonged together. It would take years before investigators fully understood how many of those fragments were connected. And even longer before they would identify the person responsible for creating them. But in the midst of uncertainty, one truth was already becoming painfully clear to the families involved. Their loved ones had not simply drifted away. They had encountered something that removed them from every familiar path they once knew. And that realization marked the true beginning of the investigation that would eventually define one of the most complex serial murder cases in American history. The incident, in its many repeated forms, was not remembered as a single moment. It was remembered as absence. A missing phone call. An empty chair. A last sighting that could not be fully explained. A silence that refused to resolve itself into anything other than fear. And somewhere within that silence, an unseen pattern was forming, one that investigators would spend decades trying to bring into the light. By the time the first bodies were recovered near the Green River, the investigation had already shifted from isolated missing person reports into something far more urgent, even though no one yet had the full language to describe what they were facing. It began with discovery. Not certainty. Not clarity. But fragments of truth emerging from places where nature had tried, and partially failed, to conceal them. The Green River itself moved slowly through King County, cutting a winding path past wooded slopes, industrial edges, and quiet stretches of land that felt far removed from the nearby city. In summer, the water ran shallow in some areas, exposing muddy banks and tangled roots. In winter, rainfall swelled its surface, carrying debris downstream and reshaping the shoreline almost overnight. It was a river that constantly changed its own geography, making it both familiar and unpredictable. That unpredictability became part of the investigation. The first discovery did not come with ceremony or warning. It came from someone who expected nothing unusual. A passerby. A worker. A person moving through a landscape they believed they already understood. Then something in the environment disrupted that assumption. A shape that did not belong. A stillness that felt wrong. And then confirmation that would permanently alter the course of the case. Once the first body was found, the response was immediate but fragmented. Local law enforcement arrived quickly, securing the area, documenting the scene, and beginning the careful process of evidence collection. Yet even as procedures were followed, the emotional weight of what had been discovered created an atmosphere that was difficult to contain. Officers who had handled violent crime before found themselves confronted with the realization that this was not an isolated incident. Because the discovery was not alone for long. As searches expanded along the riverbanks and surrounding wooded areas, additional remains were located. Each new recovery deepened the sense that investigators were dealing with a pattern rather than a singular act of violence. The spacing of the locations, the condition of the remains, and the consistency in victim profiles began to suggest a deliberate method of disposal rather than random occurrences. With each new finding, urgency increased. The investigation expanded outward, drawing in additional personnel, specialized units, and eventually forming one of the largest task forces in the history of Washington's state law enforcement. Officers from multiple agencies began working together, pooling resources, sharing information, and attempting to construct a timeline that could account for the growing number of missing and deceased individuals. But even with increased manpower, the case presented immediate challenges. The environment itself had already altered potential evidence. Rain had washed away traces. Time had degraded physical clues. Wildlife had disturbed remains in ways that made forensic interpretation more complex. In several cases, identification was not immediately possible. Without modern DNA analysis at their disposal in the early stages, investigators relied heavily on dental records, personal belongings, and missing person reports to establish identities. This process was slow, careful, and often emotionally devastating for families waiting for confirmation that they feared but still could not fully accept. Each identification carried a different kind of pain. Because it ended uncertainty. But it also confirmed loss. And in many cases, families who had held on to hope for months or years were forced into a new reality without preparation or closure. As the number of victims increased, so did public awareness. Media outlets began reporting on the discoveries with growing intensity. The term, Green River, started appearing in headlines, linking the location to a developing series of murders that had not yet been fully connected to a single perpetrator in the public's understanding. The river itself became symbolic, not because it caused the tragedy, but because it marked the geography where truth was beginning to surface. For investigators, however, symbolism offered no answers. They needed patterns. They needed consistency. They needed something that could explain how so many women had vanished without leaving clear trails. As the task force analyzed each case, they began mapping the last known locations of victims. When plotted geographically, the points formed a troubling concentration along familiar corridors, especially around Pacific Highway South and adjacent areas. This alignment suggested movement patterns rather than random distribution. It suggested access. It suggested familiarity. It suggested that whoever was responsible knew the area intimately. At the same time, witness statements from earlier missing person cases began to gain new relevance. Descriptions of vehicles. Partial license plates. Vague memories of conversations near motel parking lots. A recurring mention of a calm, unremarkable man who sometimes offered rides or approached women without raising immediate suspicion. Individually, these accounts were incomplete. Together, they began to form something more coherent. Still, the investigation remained careful not to jump to conclusions. Law enforcement understood the danger of forcing connections where none existed. Serial cases required extraordinary proof, not assumptions built on patterns alone. Every lead had to be verified. Every timeline reconstructed. Every potential suspect evaluated against available evidence. And there was another complication. Time. Some of the earliest disappearances had occurred months before investigators recognized the full scale of the situation. Witness memories had faded. Physical scenes had changed. Records were incomplete or scattered across jurisdictions. In several cases, the exact last known sighting could only be approximated. This made it extremely difficult to reconstruct the precise sequence of events. Despite these challenges, the task force continued expanding its focus. Search operations extended deeper into wooded regions surrounding the river. Volunteers assisted in covering areas that were difficult to access by vehicle. Helicopters surveyed large sections of terrain from above. Dogs trained in cadaver detection were deployed to locate additional remains. Each new discovery reinforced the same unsettling reality. This was not a series of isolated crimes. It was a sustained pattern of targeted violence. Yet even as this understanding grew among investigators, the identity of the person responsible remained frustratingly out of reach. There were suspects. There were interviews. There were individuals who attracted attention due to behavior, proximity, or prior criminal history. Some were questioned extensively. Some were tested. Some were eliminated through lack of evidence or inconsistencies in their accounts. But none could be definitively linked to all of the known cases. And without a direct connection, the investigation could not move from suspicion to prosecution. As months passed, pressure increased from both the public and the families of the missing. Every new headline intensified the urgency. Every unanswered question deepened frustration. Communities demanded results. Investigators, however, were bound by the limits of forensic technology available at the time, and by the necessity of building a case that could survive courtroom scrutiny. Behind the scenes, one of the most important developments was the formation of a dedicated task force that centralized all Green River-related cases. This allowed detectives to compare evidence across files that had previously been treated separately. Patterns that were difficult to see in isolation became clearer when placed side by side. Victim profiles aligned more consistently than initially expected. Locations clustered in predictable corridors. Timeframes overlapped in ways that suggested continuity. The idea that a single offender might be responsible became increasingly difficult to dismiss. Still, investigators needed more than probability. They needed proof. And proof, at that stage, remained elusive. As the investigation deepened, the emotional toll became increasingly visible. Detectives worked long hours under immense pressure, often reviewing graphic evidence while maintaining communication with grieving families. Many carried photographs of victims in their files, not as abstract case numbers, but as reminders of the human beings behind the investigation. For the families, the experience was even more difficult. Each update carried both hope and fear. Hope that answers might finally arrive. Fear that those answers would confirm their worst suspicions. The Green River itself continued flowing, indifferent to the weight of human tragedy unfolding along its banks. Rain returned regularly, washing over sites that had already been carefully examined. Seasons changed. Vegetation grew over disturbed ground. The landscape healed itself in ways that made the past harder to see. Yet beneath that surface, the investigation persisted. Because despite the silence, despite the delays, and despite the overwhelming scale of the case, one truth had become increasingly unavoidable for those closest to it. Someone was responsible. And until that person was identified, the river would continue to hold its secrets, waiting for the moment when science, persistence, and time would finally bring them into the open. As the Green River Task Force expanded, the investigation entered a phase defined not by discoveries, but by frustration. Every lead seemed to open a door that led nowhere. Every promising suspect eventually dissolved under scrutiny. And every reconstructed timeline revealed just enough detail to deepen the mystery without resolving it. By this point, King County law enforcement was no longer dealing with a handful of missing persons. They were confronting what appeared to be a growing series of homicides spanning multiple years, jurisdictions, and victim profiles. The task force was officially formed to unify these cases, but unity did not automatically bring clarity. Instead, it revealed the scale of what they were up against. Investigators worked in a large, crowded operations center filled with filing cabinets, maps pinned across walls, and long tables covered in case files. Photographs of missing women were arranged in rows that seemed to grow endlessly. Some images were clear school portraits. Others were casual snapshots provided by families. A few were grainy police records taken during earlier encounters with law enforcement. Each face represented a life interrupted. Each file represented a timeline that needed to be rebuilt from fragments. At the center of the investigation was a fundamental problem. They did not yet know who they were truly looking for. Without a confirmed suspect, detectives had to rely on behavioral patterns, geographic profiling, and victimology to narrow possibilities. They began to focus on individuals who knew the Pacific Highway South Corridor well. People with access to vehicles. People who could move through the area without drawing attention. People whose routines placed them near the last known locations of multiple victims. This process produced hundreds of names. Truck drivers. Former offenders. Local residents. Men who had been seen in proximity to missing persons cases. Men who simply fit statistical profiles constructed by behavioral analysts. Each name required time-consuming investigation. Each interview required documentation. Each background check consumed resources already stretched thin. Many suspects were eliminated quickly. Others lingered in the system longer, requiring deeper examination of alibis, employment records, and witness statements. In some cases, investigators revisited individuals multiple times as new information emerged. Despite this effort, no single suspect emerged who could be definitively linked to the full pattern of disappearances. One of the most significant challenges was the inconsistency of available evidence. Many crime scenes were never identified as such until long after the fact. In several cases, remains had been exposed to environmental conditions that destroyed or severely degraded forensic material. Without modern DNA technology, investigators were limited to physical evidence such as fibers, trace materials, and dental identification. Even when biological evidence was available, it could not yet provide the level of precision needed to conclusively match a suspect to multiple victims. As a result, some individuals who appeared suspicious in interviews could not be legally connected to the crimes, even if their behavior raised concern. This gap between suspicion and proof became one of the defining obstacles of the entire investigation. At the same time, witness statements continued to accumulate. Many came from women who had worked along Pacific Highway South and survived encounters with potential suspects. Their testimonies were invaluable, but also difficult to unify. Memories were naturally affected by time, stress, and trauma. Descriptions of vehicles or individuals sometimes overlapped, but rarely matched perfectly. One recurring description stood out. A calm, unassuming man. Middle-aged. Polite in conversation. Driving a vehicle that did not draw attention. Sometimes offering money without pressure. Sometimes carrying personal items, such as photographs, to present an image of normalcy. But even this pattern was not enough to identify a specific individual. It remained a behavioral sketch rather than a concrete identity. Investigators were cautious not to overcommit to any single theory. Serial homicide cases have historically been complicated by false leads, misidentifications, and assumptions formed too early in the process. The task force was determined not to repeat those mistakes. Still, the pressure was mounting. Public attention was increasing as media coverage expanded. Families of missing women demanded answers. Community concern grew along the highway corridor, where fear had begun to replace routine nighttime activity. Sex workers in the area reported increased caution, changed routes, and informal warning systems shared between individuals trying to survive in an environment now defined by uncertainty. Despite these changes, the disappearances did not immediately stop. The killer, whoever he was, continued operating with a level of confidence that suggested familiarity with law enforcement patterns and investigative limitations. He understood how to avoid drawing sustained attention. He understood how quickly initial reports could be separated before being unified into a broader case. Most importantly, he understood that without physical evidence tying him to multiple victims, suspicion alone was not enough to stop him. Inside the task force, this reality created a growing sense of urgency. Detectives began re-examining older cases that had initially been treated as unrelated. Cold files were reopened. Evidence boxes were retrieved from storage. Reports were cross-referenced in ways that had not been possible during the earliest stages of the investigation. Gradually, connections began to appear more consistently. Victim disappearances clustered within specific time frames. Certain geographic zones appeared repeatedly across different cases. Patterns of vulnerability became increasingly clear. Even so, investigators still lacked the most critical element: a direct link between any suspect and the majority of victims. This absence forced them to expand their focus even further. Surveillance operations were initiated in areas considered high risk. Undercover officers monitored parts of Pacific Highway South. Sting operations were considered and in some cases attempted. These efforts, however, were limited by resources and the difficulty of predicting the killer's movements with precision. The environment itself remained a significant obstacle. The corridor was vast, with numerous entry and exit points. Activity was constant, especially at night. Monitoring every interaction was impossible. Even with increased police presence, the scale of the area made comprehensive coverage unfeasible. Meanwhile, families of missing women continued to live in a state of suspended grief. For many, the absence of answers was more painful than confirmation of death might have been. Without closure, every possibility remained open. Hope and despair existed simultaneously, shifting day by day depending on new reports or rumors. Some families organized searches on their own. Others contacted media outlets to keep their loved ones' names in public awareness. A few worked directly with investigators, providing personal records, photographs, and detailed timelines of last known contact. Each contribution added emotional weight to the case files being studied inside the task force headquarters. Yet even with this growing body of information, the identity of the perpetrator remained unknown. Several suspects were considered promising at different stages of the investigation. Some were questioned extensively and released. Others were monitored for extended periods, but eventually cleared due to lack of evidence or verified alibis. In some cases, investigative focus shifted when new victims were discovered, or when geographic patterns changed. This constant cycle of pursuit and elimination created a sense of motion without resolution. Detectives were working harder than ever, but progress remained slow. One of the most haunting aspects of this phase of the investigation was the realization that the killer had likely already been encountered by law enforcement in some form. He may have been interviewed. He may have been considered briefly and dismissed. He may have appeared in reports or background checks without triggering immediate concern. The idea that the perpetrator was already within the investigative scope, yet still unidentified, became a deeply unsettling possibility for many involved. As the 1980s progressed, advances in forensic science were still developing, but not yet sufficient to break the case open. DNA profiling was in its infancy, and not yet capable of providing the definitive links that would later become crucial. Investigators preserved biological evidence whenever possible, but at the time, they could not fully anticipate how valuable those samples would become decades later. They were preparing for a future they could not yet see. Despite the lack of resolution, the task force continued building what would eventually become one of the most extensive homicide investigations in American history. Every file added to the archive. Every statement recorded. Every piece of evidence preserved. Because even without answers, they understood something essential. The case was not going away. It was growing. And somewhere beyond the limits of their current understanding, a pattern was waiting to be completed. For nearly 2 decades, the Green River investigation moved forward without the one thing it needed most, a scientific thread strong enough to tie suspicion to certainty. Detectives had names. They had patterns. They had witness statements that pointed toward a type of person, a behavioral profile, a familiar corridor of movement along Pacific Highway South. But what they did not have was the kind of evidence that could survive a courtroom without doubt. And then, slowly, quietly, almost without fanfare, the breakthrough began forming in the background of a case that had already consumed a generation of investigators. It did not arrive as a confession. It did not arrive as a new witness stepping forward. It arrived through something far less visible, but far more powerful: time working alongside science. By the late 1990s and early 2000s, forensic DNA technology had evolved into something investigators, in the early 1980s, could not have imagined. What once required large, fresh biological samples could now be extracted from trace evidence preserved for years. Even minute biological material, previously considered unusable, could now carry identifying genetic information. In storage rooms across King County, evidence from the Green River cases had been quietly preserved for years. Some of it had been collected from crime scenes before anyone fully understood its significance. Some had been stored as part of standard procedure, kept in case future technology might offer answers that early methods could not. At the time it was collected, no one knew just how important that decision would become. When forensic specialists revisited the evidence decades later, they were no longer limited by the constraints of early investigative science. They were able to extract DNA profiles from biological material that had remained untouched since the original investigations. Those profiles could then be compared against modern databases, and, crucially, against individuals still living and working in the community. This was the turning point the case had been waiting for. Among the preserved samples was biological evidence recovered from multiple crime scenes linked to the same unknown offender. When this DNA was analyzed using modern techniques, it produced a consistent genetic profile across several victims. That alone confirmed what investigators had long suspected: a single perpetrator was responsible for many of the cases. The next step was comparison. Investigators needed a known reference sample. That opportunity came in the form of an individual who had already been questioned years earlier during the investigation. At the time, he had not been identified as a primary suspect, but his name had remained in the broader database of persons of interest connected to the Pacific Highway South corridor. Gary Leon Ridgway. A factory worker. A man who had lived and worked in the same region for decades. Someone who, on paper, blended into the background of countless other residents. In the late 1980s, law enforcement had already collected biological material from him during earlier investigative procedures, including a swab taken under legal authority. At the time, the technology to fully utilize that sample did not yet exist in its current form. The sample was stored, archived, and ultimately became part of the vast repository of materials that would later be re-examined. When modern DNA analysis was finally applied, the results were decisive. The genetic profile recovered from multiple victims matched the sample associated with Gary Ridgway. It was not a partial match. It was not ambiguous. It was consistent across multiple evidence points. The implications were immediate and unmistakable. For investigators who had spent years chasing shifting leads, incomplete witness accounts, and inconclusive evidence, the moment represented something rare in long-term cases: clarity. But even then, caution remained essential. DNA could identify a suspect's connection to biological evidence. It could not explain every detail of behavior. It could not reconstruct intent. It could not speak for the victims whose lives had been taken. So the investigation moved carefully. Surveillance was increased. Ridgway's movements were monitored discreetly. His routines were documented. His workplace, his home, and his daily patterns were observed with a level of attention that had not been possible in earlier years. What investigators saw was, in many ways, unsettling precisely because of how ordinary it appeared. He continued going to work at the Kenworth plant. He interacted with co-workers. He maintained a routine that suggested nothing unusual. There was no visible disruption in his behavior, no dramatic shift that might signal awareness of the investigation closing in around him. He remained, as he had always been, unremarkable in appearance and demeanor. That ordinariness, once again, made the truth more difficult to emotionally process. Because it forced investigators to confront a disturbing reality, the person they were now focusing on did not match the psychological image of what many people expect a serial killer to look like. There was no outward display of chaos. No obvious sign of internal instability visible in everyday life. Only a quiet consistency that had allowed him to exist within the same community as the investigation itself. Once sufficient evidence had been assembled to support an arrest, law enforcement moved decisively. On November 30, 2001, Gary Ridgway was taken into custody as he left work. There was no dramatic chase. No confrontation in a remote location. No resistance that escalated into violence. It happened in a setting that underscored the central contradiction of the entire case. The arrest of one of the most prolific serial killers in American history occurred in the middle of an ordinary workday, surrounded by the routines of everyday life. For investigators who had spent decades building the case, the moment was both a culmination and a beginning. Because arrest did not immediately answer every question. It did not immediately identify every victim. It did not immediately close every file. But it opened the door to something the investigation had never fully had before. Direct access to the suspect himself. During initial questioning, Ridgway did not immediately offer a full confession. As with many major cases, early stages focused on establishing facts, confronting him with evidence, and preparing for formal legal proceedings. But over time, as the weight of forensic proof became undeniable, he began to cooperate. What followed would become one of the most extensive confessions in American criminal history. He led investigators to locations where victims had been left. He provided details about cases that had remained unsolved for decades. He described actions with a level of emotional detachment that investigators later struggled to fully articulate in interviews. There was no dramatic expression of remorse in the traditional sense. No emotional collapse that fit common expectations. Instead, there was a calm, matter-of-fact recounting of events that left experienced detectives unsettled precisely because of how ordinary his tone remained while discussing extraordinary violence. Through his cooperation, many long-missing women were finally identified or confirmed. Families who had waited years, sometimes decades, received answers that were both devastating and necessary. In some cases, they were able to locate remains and hold funerals. In others, they finally understood what had happened even if physical recovery was no longer possible. The investigation that had once been defined by uncertainty began transitioning into a different phase: confirmation, documentation, and accountability. But even in this moment of breakthrough, the emotional weight of the case did not diminish. If anything, it deepened. Because every answer came with the recognition of how long those answers had been delayed. And every newly confirmed victim reminded investigators and families alike that behind every file number was a life that had been waiting for justice that arrived far too late. The breakthrough had finally come. But it had come after years of silence, and after countless lives had already been lost to it. By the time Gary Ridgway stood before a courtroom, the case was no longer an unfolding mystery. It was a completed map drawn in reverse, names added after the fact, timelines reconstructed from memory, and truths extracted from a man who had once believed he would never be held fully accountable. The King County Courthouse carried an atmosphere that felt heavier than its architecture suggested. Outside, life in Seattle continued in its usual rhythm, traffic moving through wet streets, commuters checking watches, the distant sound of construction blending into the city's constant background noise. But inside the building, time seemed to behave differently. Every hallway carried the quiet tension of a case that had stretched across decades, now converging into a single point. The courtroom itself was not filled with spectacle. There was no theatrical display of emotion designed for public consumption. Instead, there was a restrained, almost controlled intensity. Prosecutors, defense attorneys, investigators, and family members occupied their spaces with a shared awareness that what was unfolding had already been lived through in fragments over many years. This was not the beginning of the story. It was the accounting of it. For the families of the victims, entering the courtroom meant confronting something they had long imagined, but never fully accepted. Some had waited for decades, without knowing whether their loved ones were alive or dead. Others had already received confirmation through investigative breakthroughs, but still carried the emotional weight of unanswered details. Even with answers now available, grief did not reorganize itself neatly. It arrived in layers. Some families sat quietly, holding photographs that had aged alongside their memories. Others leaned forward slightly, as if proximity to the proceedings might somehow bring greater clarity or permanence to the truth being spoken. A few avoided looking directly at the defendant, choosing instead to focus on papers, hands, or the floor, as if the physical act of not seeing could make the moment more bearable. Gary Ridgway entered the courtroom without visible urgency. There was no resistance in his posture, no dramatic expression, no attempt to disrupt the formal process around him. He was present, physically, but emotionally distant in a way that unsettled those observing him. Years of investigation had prepared many people for a confrontation with someone monstrous in appearance or behavior. Instead, they encountered someone who looked unremarkably ordinary, even in the context of the charges against him. That contrast remained one of the most difficult aspects of the case for many investigators and families alike. Because it forced a question that could not be easily resolved. How could so much violence exist behind something so outwardly normal? The prosecution's case was built on a foundation that had taken years to assemble. It included forensic evidence, DNA analysis, victim identification, geographic patterns, witness statements, and eventually, Ridgway's own admissions. Each piece alone might not have been sufficient to close the case. Together, they formed a structure too strong to ignore. But the courtroom was not only about proving guilt. It was also about giving voice to those who could no longer speak. During victim impact statements, the tone of the room shifted noticeably. These moments were not technical. They were personal. Families spoke about daughters, sisters, friends, and mothers who had once filled their lives with presence and personality. They described ordinary memories that had become permanently fixed in time, laughter in kitchens, phone calls that ended too quickly, photographs taken on days that now felt far away. There was no single way to speak about loss that large. Some voices were steady, controlled by years of preparing for a moment like this. Others broke under the weight of finally speaking aloud what had been carried internally for so long. Silence between statements often felt just as meaningful as words, allowing the courtroom to absorb what language could not fully contain. Throughout it all, Ridgway remained largely still. When he did speak, his tone was measured. He answered questions, acknowledged responsibility, and confirmed details of crimes that investigators had spent decades trying to understand. His cooperation, while legally significant, did not erase the emotional distance many observers perceived in his demeanor. There was no attempt to explain his actions in a way that aligned with psychological expectation or narrative clarity. Instead, what emerged was a factual recounting of behavior that left little room for comfort or comprehension. For many in the room, this lack of emotional framing was deeply unsettling. Because it removed the possibility of easy explanation. There were no clear emotional anchors to interpret his actions through a familiar lens of remorse or visible internal conflict. Just acknowledgement. And the facts that acknowledgement carried. As the proceedings continued, the full scale of the case became impossible to ignore in a way that even years of investigation had not fully conveyed. 49 confirmed murders. Dozens more suspected. Lives spanning years of activity. An operation of violence that had existed alongside everyday life in the same geographic region where millions of ordinary actions had taken place. The magnitude was not abstract in the courtroom. It was present in the faces of the people sitting just a few feet away from the man responsible. One of the most significant aspects of the legal resolution came in the form of the plea agreement. In exchange for his detailed cooperation and confessions, Ridgway was spared the death penalty. Instead, he agreed to plead guilty to 49 counts of aggravated first-degree murder. The sentence would be life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. The decision was not without controversy. For some families, the idea that he would not face execution felt like an incomplete form of justice. For others, the agreement represented something more practical and meaningful, the ability to finally locate remains, confirm identities, and close chapters that had remained open for decades. The emotional divide within families reflected the complexity of justice itself, particularly in cases where answers had been delayed for so long. There was no single consensus. Only individual responses shaped by individual loss. When the sentencing phase arrived, the courtroom once again became a space where language carried enormous weight. Judges, attorneys, and families all participated in the final formal articulation of responsibility and consequence. The legal system moved toward its conclusion with precision, but not without acknowledgement of what had been endured along the way. Ridgway was sentenced to multiple consecutive life terms without the possibility of parole, ensuring that he would remain incarcerated for the remainder of his natural life. For the court, this represented the final legal resolution. For investigators, it marked the end of a decades-long pursuit. But for families, closure was more complicated. Because sentencing, while definitive in legal terms, could not reverse absence. It could not restore time. It could not return voices that had been silenced. In the days following the courtroom proceedings, reactions across the region were mixed but deeply reflective. Many people struggled to process how a case of such scale had unfolded over so many years within familiar communities, without earlier resolution. Others focused on the resilience of investigators, who had continued pursuing answers despite repeated setbacks and limited early forensic tools. Within law enforcement, there was a shared recognition that the case had fundamentally changed investigative practice. The importance of preserving evidence, even when immediate use was not possible, became a defining lesson. The value of emerging DNA technology was no longer theoretical. It had proven decisive in resolving one of the most complex serial murder cases in American history. Yet even with those institutional lessons, the emotional reality of the case remained unchanged. 49 confirmed lives had been taken. Each one represented a family altered permanently. Each one represented a future that never had the chance to fully unfold. As Ridgway was transferred into the custody of the state correctional system, the case transitioned fully from active prosecution to historical record. Investigators continued certain aspects of follow-up work, including identification of additional possible victims and clarification of unresolved details, but the central legal chapter had reached its conclusion. Still, for many involved, the story did not feel finished. Because while the courtroom had delivered a sentence, it could not fully account for the years of silence that preceded it. Nor could it fully express the weight carried by those who had waited for answers that arrived long after they were most needed. The Green River case, as it would come to be known in history, now stood as both a resolution and a reminder. A resolution of guilt. A reminder of loss. And a testament to how long justice can take when the truth is hidden in plain sight, waiting for the moment when technology, persistence, and memory finally converge. In the months after the sentencing, the Green River investigation did not simply end, it slowly transformed into something else. What had once been an urgent, living pursuit across riverbanks, highways, and decades of missing person files became a long process of reconstruction. The focus shifted from capturing a suspect to understanding the full scope of what had happened, victim by victim, detail by detail, name by name. For investigators, this phase carried a different kind of weight. The adrenaline of pursuit was gone. In its place remained responsibility. Responsibility to account for every life confirmed, and every life still uncertain. Even after Gary Ridgway was incarcerated, the work inside King County law enforcement continued. Case files remained open. Cold evidence continued to be re-examined. Teams worked through archives that stretched back to the early 1980s, revisiting reports that had once seemed incomplete or disconnected. Every folder represented a possibility that something had been missed, overlooked, or not yet understood. Because even in a case with 49 confirmed victims, investigators never stopped asking whether the true number was higher. That question lingered in almost every discussion. Not as speculation for its own sake, but as an acknowledgement of the reality they had already uncovered. Many victims had only been identified through years of incremental breakthroughs, and some cases remained partially unresolved even after confession. For families, the aftermath was equally complex. Some finally received remains after decades of uncertainty, allowing them to hold funerals, mark graves, and create physical places of remembrance. These moments were both devastating and necessary. Closure, when it arrived, often came in the form of grief that had been postponed rather than resolved. Others learned the details of what had happened without ever recovering physical remains. For them, the absence remained permanent, but the uncertainty had finally been replaced by truth. That shift, while painful, allowed a different kind of mourning, one grounded in knowledge rather than imagination. Across Washington state, the impact of the case extended beyond individual families. The Green River investigation had fundamentally changed how law enforcement approached serial homicide cases involving vulnerable populations. One of the most important lessons was the necessity of treating missing persons cases with urgency regardless of a victim's background or circumstances. The assumption that certain disappearances were less urgent had delayed early connections in the case, and that realization became a lasting point of reform and reflection. Another major shift involved forensic preservation. Evidence that had been stored for years, sometimes without clear expectation of future use, became crucial once DNA technology advanced. The case demonstrated that materials considered insignificant in one decade could become decisive in another. This understanding led to changes in how agencies stored, catalogued, and protected biological evidence going forward. The role of coordination also became a defining lesson. Before the formation of the Green River Task Force, cases had been spread across jurisdictions, making it difficult to recognize patterns early. The consolidation of information into a centralized investigative structure ultimately proved essential in understanding the scope of the crimes. That model influenced future multi-jurisdictional investigations across the United States. But beyond procedural changes, there was a deeper, more human lesson embedded in the case. It forced a confrontation with how society perceives vulnerability. Many of the victims had lived lives marked by instability, addiction, or homelessness. In earlier stages of the investigation, those circumstances sometimes contributed, consciously or unconsciously, to delays in reporting or reduced urgency in response. The resolution of the case challenged those assumptions directly, emphasizing that vulnerability does not diminish the value of a life or the urgency of its protection. Inside law enforcement training programs, the Green River case gradually became a reference point. Not as a single narrative, but as a collection of lessons about evidence, persistence, bias, and the evolution of forensic science. New detectives studied it not only to understand how the investigation succeeded in its later stages, but also to understand why it took so long to reach that point. Meanwhile, Gary Ridgway remained in prison, serving multiple life sentences without the possibility of parole. Over time, his name became synonymous with one of the most extensive serial murder cases in American history. Yet even in incarceration, the case against him continued to generate discussion among investigators and analysts, particularly regarding the possibility of additional victims who were never conclusively linked. Despite his extensive confessions, questions remained. Some locations he described were verified. Others remained uncertain or incomplete. And in a case spanning years of activity across multiple environments, absolute completeness was difficult to guarantee. That uncertainty, however, no longer shaped active pursuit. It shaped historical reflection. The river itself, which had once been the focal point of discovery, continued flowing as it always had. Over time, vegetation grew over many of the sites where remains had been found. Nature gradually reclaimed areas that had once been scenes of intensive investigation. Trails changed. Landscapes shifted. The physical reminders of the case became less visible, even as its impact remained deeply embedded in institutional memory. Yet for those who had lived through the investigation, the Green River would never simply be a geographic feature again. It had become a marker of loss. A name attached to years of searching, waiting, and ultimately understanding. In quiet moments, some investigators reflected on how easily the pattern might have remained hidden, if not for persistence and eventual technological advancement. Others considered the emotional toll carried by families who had spent years without answers, navigating uncertainty that most people never have to imagine. There was no single moment when the case felt truly finished. Instead, it reached a point of transition, where active investigation gave way to reflection, documentation, and legacy. The story of the Green River Killer became more than a criminal case file. It became a reference point for understanding how serial crimes can persist in plain sight, how investigative systems evolve under pressure, and how science can eventually illuminate truths that once seemed permanently out of reach. But beneath all of those lessons remained something simpler and far more enduring. 49 confirmed lives. Dozens of families forever changed. And a long period of silence that had finally been broken, not with comfort, but with truth. In the end, what remained was not just the story of a killer. It was the reminder of what was lost while he remained unseen. And the understanding that justice, even when delayed, still matters, because every name recovered from silence is a refusal to let that silence define them. Long after the courtroom emptied and the files were archived, the Green River case continued to exist in a quieter, more enduring form, no longer as an active investigation, but as a permanent echo within the systems that had once struggled to contain it. For the public, the name Green River Killer eventually became familiar in the way history absorbs even its most disturbing chapters. It appeared in documentaries, books, training materials, and academic discussions about forensic science and criminal psychology. Yet for those closest to the case, investigators, families, and surviving communities, it was never simply a subject of study. It was a lived experience that had reshaped entire decades. One of the most lasting effects of the case was the way it changed expectations around missing persons investigations. Before the Green River Task Force, cases involving vulnerable women were often fragmented across jurisdictions, with limited coordination and inconsistent prioritization. Afterward, that approach began to shift. Agencies increasingly recognized that patterns could be hidden in plain sight when information was not shared efficiently. The case also became a turning point for forensic preservation practices. Evidence that had been stored for years, initially without anticipation of DNA analysis, became the foundation for solving one of the most complex serial murder investigations in American history. This reality transformed how departments across the country approached storage, labeling, and long-term retention of biological material. What had once been seen as archival burden became recognized as potential future proof. But perhaps the most profound legacy of the Green River case was not procedural. It was human. Families who had once lived in a state of suspended grief slowly began to redefine what closure meant to them. For some, closure arrived through identification of remains and the ability to hold funerals, visit graves, and speak openly about loved ones without the shadow of uncertainty. These moments did not erase pain, but they gave it form. They allowed memory to settle into something tangible rather than unresolved absence. For others, closure came through knowledge alone. Knowing what happened, even without physical recovery, brought an end to years of unanswered questions. It allowed them to stop searching in endless directions and begin, however painfully, to accept a reality that had finally been confirmed. And for some families, even that clarity could not fully resolve the emotional weight they carried. The passage of time before answers were found meant that grief had already reshaped their lives in irreversible ways. Children had grown up without siblings. Parents had aged without knowing what had happened to their daughters. Entire family structures had changed while waiting for information that arrived too late to restore what had been lost. In law enforcement circles, the Green River case became a cornerstone of modern investigative training. New detectives studied it not only for its resolution, but for its early failures, moments when connections were not yet visible, when evidence was not yet fully understood, and when technological limitations delayed critical breakthroughs. The case became a reminder that persistence matters as much as immediate success, and that unresolved files should never be dismissed simply because they are difficult. The role of DNA technology in the case also became symbolic of a broader transformation in criminal justice. What began as preserved evidence in storage eventually became the key that unlocked decades of uncertainty. That transition reinforced a fundamental shift in investigative thinking, that evidence can outlive the tools used to analyze it, and that today's limitations do not define tomorrow's possibilities. Within the communities affected along Pacific Highway South, the passage of time brought visible changes as well. Some of the motels that once defined the corridor were renovated or replaced. Certain lots were redeveloped. Streets were renamed or restructured. Yet memory persisted beneath those physical changes. For those who lived through the era, the geography still carried emotional weight, even when its appearance had changed. The Green River itself continued its natural course, unaffected by the human history tied to its name. Over the years, vegetation returned to many of the areas where investigations had once been concentrated. Rainfall smoothed the land. Trails shifted. In many places, it became difficult to see any visible trace of what had once occurred there. Nature, in its own way, reclaimed what had been disturbed. But memory did not follow the same process. For investigators who worked the case, certain images remained permanent. Photographs pinned across walls. Maps marked with colored pins. Evidence rooms filled with files that represented years of effort. Even in retirement, many of those involved carried the case with them, not as an active burden, but as a defining chapter of their professional lives. Forensic scientists, who had worked on the DNA breakthroughs, reflected on how rapidly their field had changed. Techniques that were experimental during the early phases of the investigation became standard practice within a single generation. The Green River case stood as one of the clearest demonstrations of how scientific advancement can reshape justice long after the original crimes have occurred. Gary Ridgway, meanwhile, remained incarcerated, serving multiple life sentences without the possibility of parole. Over time, his name became permanently associated with one of the most extensive serial murder investigations in United States history. Yet even within the confines of prison, the case continued to be studied, analyzed, and revisited by researchers seeking to understand patterns of behavior, investigative challenges, and systemic failures that allowed the crimes to continue for so long. Despite the resolution of the legal case, some questions remained part of ongoing discussion among experts. The full number of victims may never be definitively known. Some details of individual cases remain incomplete. And in any investigation of this scale, absolute certainty across every element is rarely possible. But what was known was already immense. 49 confirmed victims. Years of sustained violence. A long period of undetected activity within familiar environments. And an eventual breakthrough made possible by science that did not exist when the crimes began. In the broader history of criminal investigation, the Green River case now stands as a reference point for both progress and caution. It demonstrates how advancements in technology can eventually solve even the most complex cases, but also how delays in recognition, communication, and prioritization can allow patterns to persist far longer than they should. It is a reminder that justice is not always immediate, but it is also not always lost. Sometimes it simply waits for the moment when enough pieces finally align. At its core, however, the story is not defined by the person who committed the crimes. It is defined by those who were affected by them. The women whose lives were taken. The families who refused to forget. The investigators who continued searching long after certainty seemed unlikely. And the systems that eventually evolved to ensure that similar patterns would be harder to overlook in the future. The Green River investigation closed officially, but its impact remains open-ended in a different sense. It continues to influence how missing persons cases are handled, how evidence is preserved, and how law enforcement understands the importance of persistence over time. And in that continued influence, the victims are not reduced to numbers in a file. They remain part of a story that ultimately reshaped the way justice itself is pursued. Not because the crimes defined them, but because the pursuit of truth, however delayed, refused to let them disappear into silence.